Hello, all you subjects of the internet out there. This is the Aromantic Shipper back again with yet another video. So, as those of you who have been watching my videos would know, in 2021, I sat down to watch Game of Thrones for the first time with my dad. By the way, full spoilers ahead for all of Game of Thrones in this video. You have been warned. Anyway, I had been a bit skeptical about watching Game of Thrones since, the final season of the show is almost universally despised, but, I had still heard that seasons 1 to 6 were pretty good, and yeah, I can confidently say that I thoroughly enjoyed watching the show. There's a lot to like about Game of Thrones, from the high production values, epic battles, complex and nuanced characters, the massive scope of the world and the story, and the more realistic aspect of conflict and ruling that you don't often see in fantasy. The show is, of course, based on the highly acclaimed book series A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin. However, because old Georgie writes at glacial speed, the show ended up running out of source material and eventually was forced to go in its own direction away from the books. And that created some problems, to say the least. There are some people who complain about this, saying, oh, the writers should have just been patient and waited until George finished the books. And, the man needs time to write a story, and you can't rush these things. But, let's be real, that was never going to happen. What was HBO supposed to do? Suspend its most popular show into an indefinite hiatus? For crying out loud, the show concluded its run over 2 years ago, and George still hasn't released The Winds of Winter yet. Plus, Game of Thrones has super high production standards, and laying off the entire production crew and then trying to get them all back again would be an insane problem of logistics. Not to mention, the actors get older over time, and it would have been completely jarring to see the characters looking a decade older season by season. Now, maybe the show could have gone on hiatus if it was animated, like Attack on Titan did between seasons 1 and 2 to wait for more source material to come out. Which, by the way, is just another reason why animation is a superior medium to live action that I plan to talk about in a future video essay called Why Animation is Superior to Live Action. But yeah, with how Game of Thrones was produced, there was just no choice but to go past the books. Now, this doesn't mean the show was doomed to fail. Martin had created a pretty great jumping-off point for showrunners Dan Weiss and David Benioff to lead the world and story Martin created into a satisfying and unique show-only conclusion. It could have created a Full Metal Alchemist situation, where A Song of Ice and Fire series could have come out after George finally finished writing the books, if he ever does, that would be completely faithful to the books, and fans of the franchise would compare the relative strengths and weaknesses of the two adaptations. But, well, let's just say that Dave and Dan have been nicknamed Dumb and Dumber for a reason, and while they did an adequate job of adapting book material, when they started to diverge from the books in too great a capacity, things started to fall apart. I think when I was first watching the series, the point where I really started to notice that the show was suffering from problems was season 6. Now, the cracks were definitely starting to show in season 5, and looking back on it, especially now that I've read the books, many of the decisions made in that season were downright ludicrous. But I didn't really notice it on first watch because I was mostly distracted by how fucking good Hardhome was. I've already made a video discussing why I think the Battle of the Bastards is highly overrated and it's actually pretty dumb despite looking gorgeous, so I won't gripe about it here, but I really just found everything surrounding Jon's character in Season 6 to be extremely frustrating. They killed him off at the end of Season 5 just to revive him in Episode 2 of Season 6 with no effort, no consequences, and no real changes in Jon's character because it's still needed for the plot. These are the same writers who, by the way, chose not to revive Catelyn Stark like Martin does in the books because it would take away from the impact of the Red Wedding. But in Martin's case, the revived Catelyn Stark isn't anything like her former self and is basically a heartless zombie, hellbent on vengeance, unlike Jon, who is literally the same character after being brought back to life. And also, Davos tells Jon that it doesn't matter how or why he was brought back to life, which is basically the showrunner's way of telling the audience, fuck you, we don't have to give an explanation for why things happen, just accept it and look at the great cinematography that people far more talented than us directed. Season 7 was the point where the show just entirely separated itself from having anything to do with the books, and it shows because the problems just got worse. The pacing was way too fast, characters were teleporting all over the map, despite it previously taking characters an entire season just to get somewhere. There were a bunch of completely nonsensical decisions the characters made, and the plot armor was insane. But even with all that said, I would still say Season 7 was good-ish. It was just really fun to see characters who have been separated for the entire story up to this point finally meeting up in this season, and there were still a bunch of awesome and satisfying moments and scenes. I mean, Jaime leaving Cersei, Jon allying with Daenerys, Sam meeting Jorah, the Siege of Highgarden, Daenerys versus the Lannister army, Euron allying with Cersei. These are all satisfying plot developments that the story beforehand seemed to be building to, even if how we got there didn't always make sense. It at least felt like Dumb and Dumber were trying in this season. Maybe not trying all that hard, but, the episodes often felt like a first draft, but still a first draft that had some effort put into it. So, with a whole extra year to write for Season 8, even if it isn't on the same quality as Martin's writing, I'm sure they'll still manage to give us a satisfying ending, right?
Thanks, I hate it.
I have to say, Season 8 successfully subverted my expectations. I expected it to be bad. I didn't expect it to be this bad. It's like, in Season 7, Dumb and Dumber were trying to bend over backwards to please the fans and create hypothetically satisfying moments, regardless of the story. But in Season 8, the writers thought up the most satisfying way they could end the show and said, yeah, let's just do the exact opposite of that. Story and fanbase be damned, because we need to subvert expectations. It's like, for some things, I could give them the benefit of the doubt. Like, okay, Arya killing the Night King, it was stupid, but maybe they just couldn't figure out how to resolve that plotline. But for other stuff, like Jaime suddenly going back on 5 seasons of character development, I just have no sympathy. You didn't have to make Jaime suddenly not care about innocent people. If you want him to die with Cersei in the end, just have him go to negotiate with her about a peaceful surrender. You chose to write this when you clearly didn't have to, as a giant fuck you to the audience, who were actually invested in Jaime's story and thought it actually meant something. And in addition to making decisions geared towards actively pissing off the audience, Season 8 just felt so lazy. The attention to detail and the methodical setup in the earlier seasons was completely gone, and they didn't even bother trying to give explanations for anything anymore. Like why and how Euron captured Missandei out of a giant shipwreckage, and why the characters would just immediately assume Missandei was captured and didn't just drown. There's practically a plot hole in every single minute of this season, and it was just so frustrating. If I could succinctly explain the most major factors that ruined Game of Thrones, it would be these two things. 1. Events stopped following the logic of the world that was set up. 2. Events ceased to matter for the overall story. Let's compare, as an example, a death scene in Game of Thrones Season 8 to 2 deaths in Season 1. In Season 8, as Daenerys is flying back to Dragonstone, her dragon Rhaegal gets shot out of the sky by Euron's fleet. I get the sense that this moment was meant to be shocking, to recapture the feeling felt for shocking deaths in the previous seasons of the show. In Season 1, Ned Stark gets beheaded in Episode 9. To be honest, even if that scene hadn't been spoiled to me beforehand, I don't really think it was as shocking as people say, since the show was throwing out death flags left and right for him, but it is still really jarring to see the main character of the main plotline die in the first season in such a sudden manner. However, even though it's shocking, Ned Stark's death still makes total sense in the logic of the story, considering what was set up beforehand. Joffrey doesn't just flip from a righteous freer of slaves to a mass murderer. It's been clearly established that he is a psychotic, evil bitch who would kill Ned Stark for his wounded pride, even if it was not a smart decision to make. And Ned Stark's death is an incredibly important death, as it is the catalyst which pretty much sets up the entire story going forward in the War of the Five Kings. Khal Drogo also had a shocking death in Season 1. I mean, the story had set him up as this invincible warrior who had never been defeated, who was about to wreak havoc on Westeros, so it is a total shock that he is taken out by an infected wound. I mean, technically he didn't die from the infected wound, I know, but it is what sealed his fate in the end. But again, his fate isn't just for shock value. It makes total sense that Mirri Maz Duur would want to see Khal Drogo die and intentionally sabotage his medical treatment, since his Khalasar raped her and killed her friends. But Khal Drogo's death is also incredibly important to Daenerys' storyline, because Drogo's death is the catalyst for her realizing that she can't just rely on a powerful spouse to take back her throne, and has to build herself up through her own effort. Back in Season 1, character deaths made sense, and they had actual meaning. Contrast this to Rhaegal's death in Season 8. The scene makes absolutely no sense. First of all, how on earth did the Iron Fleet just sneak up on Daenerys, who had a bird's-eye view of her surroundings? How did Euron manage to hit 3 consecutive scorpion shots on a moving target that is far away? I mean, Daenerys couldn't see the Iron Fleet, so Euron probably couldn't see the dragons. Does he have X-ray vision to land a perfect shot behind the rocks? On top of that, this scene doesn't even make sense in the context of the very next episode, where Daenerys flies on Drogon, a bigger target than Rhaegal, by the way, and just completely demolishes every single scorpion at King's Landing effortlessly, without getting hit once. But in addition to Rhaegal's death just making no sense, is also completely pointless. Rhaegal dying so easily could have been used to establish that the Scorpions were incredibly dangerous and served to greatly weaken Daenerys in the final battle, but in the next episode, like I said, Euron must have just had stormtroopers manning them all because none of them can seem to hit this damn thing, and Daenerys crushes Cersei's forces without breaking a sweat. What did Rhaegal dying actually add? It's just something that happened for no real reason. Daenerys doesn't even spend that much time mourning him. Wouldn't it have made more sense for Rhaegal to die during the attack on King's Landing and to have the death of Daenerys' child be the straw that breaks the camel's back, and have Daenerys burn down the city rather than Missandei falling off its cone or her getting triggered by bells or whatever the fuck? Rhaegal's death, unlike deaths in the earlier seasons, made no sense and had zero actual impact on the story or characters. And this kind of thing happens so many times in the later seasons, and especially the final season. It sucks, too, because the actors and special effects team poured their heart and soul into making this final season as good as possible, despite the writers so clearly not giving a shit and just wanted to wrap things up so that they could move on to their Star Wars deal. And it's heartbreaking to hear the cast members' disappointment in the final season and how their characters were handled, seeping through their voice whenever they talk about it.
How do you feel about the way that it ends?
There are no better writers in television than Dan Weiss and David Benioff. They ended it brilliantly, better than I could have imagined, and you people are in for it.
I am loyal to King Joffrey, my one true love.
So yeah, Game of Thrones is an absolute shit show with one of the worst endings in TV show history. And, as my brain tends to do when I'm not satisfied with how a story turns out, I get to thinking about how it could have been better. My brain has been a-stirring with ideas for a rewrite series of Game of Thrones ever since I finished watching the series. And I know other people on YouTube have already done rewrite videos for Game of Thrones, but I am going to go ahead and give my 2 cents as well. I'm not a professional writer by any standard. I'm just a guy with a phone and some $3 editing software. I don't have any special qualifications, so feel free to disagree with me or post down in the comments below how you think the series could have been better. Also, this rewrite series will be containing spoilers for the books as well, since they will definitely be relevant for what I'm going to be talking about. I actually managed to read all of them really fast, including A World of Ice and Fire in about 3 months. Ha! There's your qualifications for you. So before we actually get going on this rewrite, we're going to have to make something clear first. At what point in the show are we starting from? Now, many people who try to rewrite the show usually start from some point after Season 4, and while I admit that Season 5 and onwards are where the major problems of the series really start to rear their ugly head, looking back on the series and comparing it to the books, I would honestly say that there have been problems with the show since the first season. In fact, since the first scene of the show, which contains a change from the books so incomprehensibly dumb that it's hard for me to figure out why the writers would do something like this. You see, the show starts out just like the first book does, with the men in black going out past the wall and encountering the others, or the White Walkers, as the show refers to them as, and all but one of them being killed. But in the books, the one who survived was scouting up in a tree while his brothers got attacked by the others. And because he stayed silent in the tree and waited until they left, he was able to escape. In the show, though, this doesn't happen, and he somehow escapes despite being on the ground with a White Walker being right in front of him. How? Did the White Walker just let him go as a message? Why? Why would the White Walkers want people to know they exist? If their existence was known, then a massive army might get sent north to try to kill them. You know, like what happened? In retrospect, it probably should have been a red flag when the first scene of the entire show makes absolutely no goddamn sense at all. It really shows just how incompetent Dumb and Dumber are when deviating just a smidge from George R. R. Martin's source material. Thus, before I can get to major issues with the show, like, down the line, I'm actually going to be starting this rewrite series all the way back in Season 1. This video will be focusing on the changes I would make to the first season of the show, and subsequent videos will continue on from there. Since I and many others agree that later seasons of the show were rushed, I am also going to be extending my rewritten season of Game of Thrones to 11 full seasons of content, though I am going to try to keep the general events of the show mostly intact. I'm going to have to change some things for sure, like Bran becoming king and Daenerys burning down King's Landing, probably the 2 most nonsensical moments in the entire series, but even stuff like Arya killing the Night King, I think could work, provided it was actually built up to and actually had meaning attached to it. Also, just as a disclaimer, I know that Game of Thrones, the television show, was constrained by its budget and thus wasn't always able to do the stuff that happened in the book, which is yet another reason why I'm hoping for a future Song of Ice and Fire animated series, because animation has a lot less constraints than live action. But for my rewrite, we're just going to be going under the assumption that the budget is unlimited to do whatever crazy shit the series wants. Alright, with all that out of the way, let's just get on to examining how I would rewrite Season 1 of Game of Thrones. So, Season 1 of Game of Thrones will definitely have the least changes from the original show. This is largely because the first season of Game of Thrones has the least changes made from the original source material, and I think that you'll find many of the changes that I would make to the series in my rewrite before we get on to show-only content is just make it more like the books. Because for real, George R. R. Martin is honestly a genius writer, and the immense amount of time his readers have to wait for new books to come out is nearly worth it for just how good they are. Thus, although I don't think Season 1 is my favorite season, it probably has the least flaws, though there are a few things I would mention. First, let's talk about that prologue scene that kicks off the first episode of the series I mentioned before. I suppose it would be easy to just say that it should be closer to the books and just have the man in black hiding up in the tree, but even disregarding that, the whole scene seems out of place in the show. See, George R. R. Martin's book series is called A Song of Ice and Fire, only the first book is called A Game of Thrones. It's pretty clear that ice and fire are the true main focus of the book series, and that the others are going to be the final threat of the story, with the Game of Thrones just being the lead-up to what's to come. Thus, it makes total sense why the prologue that introduces the others is in the first chapter of the book. The first scene is supposed to introduce the audience to what the story is truly about. By the way, side note, some people might be confused by me calling White Walkers others, but see, that's what they're called in the book most often. In the show, they changed it to calling them White Walkers exclusively to, capitalize off The Walking Dead's popularity, I guess. However, while I will sometimes be referring to them as the White Walkers when I'm talking about the original show, I will be calling them others in my rewrite, seeing as how the Great Other and its war with Roiler is going to be a much more important plot point in my rewrite. But anyway, like I was saying before, in the show, it's different. The show isn't called A Song of Ice and Fire, it's called A Game of Thrones. And the White Walkers are not the final threat of the story. The final conflict of Game of Thrones is the Game of Thrones, and the contest between Cersei and Daenerys for the Iron Throne. I, like many others, was disappointed that the White Walkers, which were for so long built up to as the ultimate threat to humanity, were defeated so easily in just a single episode, and don't get me wrong, I'm definitely going to be making some changes to the White Walker storyline to give it much more weight, but ultimately, since I'm trying to still keep the overall outline of the original show intact, the others will be dealt with before Cersei is, with the siege on King's Landing being the final climax of the story. If and when George actually manages to finish his book series, I'm sure the battle against the others will be absolutely amazing and perfectly tie in with the themes of the story, but I think it was a perfectly legitimate decision for the TV writers to have the final battle be a political one rather than against a force of nature like the Night King. And I don't agree with people who were like, oh, they defeated Satan, why should we care about who becomes president next? The story can work, it was just executed incredibly poorly. However, this still, of course, has the problem of the first scene of the show. The first scene of any series needs to show what the series is going to be about, and if the main threat isn't the others, why would you start the series off by showcasing them specifically? So how do we solve this? Well, just cut the beginning scene out. Just don't adapt the prologue scene from the books. Instead, the first scene would be Ned Stark executing the King's justice on the Night's Watch deserter, showcasing the cruelty of this world and displaying the themes of justice, honor, and duty. Or better yet, the first scene of the show could be a flashback of Robert Baratheon killing Rhaegar Targaryen on the Trident, the conflict that put the events of the whole show into motion. The flashback would also show the audience how fearsome a warrior Robert was rather than just telling us, and would serve as a perfect contrast to the King Robert of the present day. In general, I kind of wish that Game of Thrones had more flashbacks in it. In the books, we get to learn a lot about the characters and the world's backstory through inner dialogue, but since there is no inner dialogue in the show, it probably would have been a good idea to implement more flashbacks like they did with the Maggie the Frog prophecy in Season 5, to give context to present events that was often lost in the book-to-show adaptation. But anyway, cutting out the introduction of the others would mean that when the people of the Night's Watch are warning about spooky stuff they find beyond the wall, the audience, who hasn't read the books anyway, would actually not know if it was real or not. In keeping the audience in the dark about the others, it would actually present an interesting show-only opportunity. What if magic and the supernatural was actually a twist in the first season? I mean, technically the direwolves are just large wolves. There's no indication that there is anything supernatural about them. And since the show is in a medieval setting where people were very superstitious, the audience might think that when characters talk about dragons and giants, they aren't actually real, and stuff like the dragon eggs and skeletons are just man-made carvings. Maybe this is only a thought exclusive to me, but I just think it would be a really cool creative decision if the show started off making you think it was just a medieval political thriller, and then by the end of the season, bam, hits you with the reveal that magic actually exists in this world. Thus, in my rewritten version of Season 1, Bran's three-eyed raven dreams would only be talked about and not shown, Jon getting attacked by wights would actually be moved to the final episode, and magic would overall be portrayed as more mysterious than it was in the original season and in the book. It's just an idea I had, and I think it works well for the show, seeing as how the magical aspects were toned down in the adaptation. Anyway, I'll talk more about the whole business with magic and the others later in the video, but until then, what else would I change? Well, rather than going episode by episode, I'll start by going plotline by plotline, since a show like Game of Thrones, it's a lot easier that way. Let's first start with Daenerys' plotline, since it's the most separate from all the rest. Her story is basically almost exactly the same as it is in the books, and the additions that were made to it, like a lot of the scenes giving the side characters in the story more depth and focus than in the book, like Doreah, Jorah, and Drogo's Blood Riders, were definitely appreciated. However, there is one change due to Daenerys' storyline in the show that certainly, caused some controversy to say the least. In the first episode, during Drogo and Daenerys' wedding, Drogo rapes her, but in the books this does not happen, and Drogo asks Daenerys for her consent first. This was the first in quite a few instances of the show having female characters being raped that weren't raped in the books, see Cersei and Sansa for instance. But to be honest, I don't really have much of a problem with this change, unlike some other people. I mean, yeah, in the books, Drogo does ask Daenerys for consent first, but Viserys threatened to beat her bloody if she didn't please him, and in the books, she is a literal child, so, did Drogo really have consent? What I'm trying to say is that there wasn't much the show could have done to make Daenerys and Drogo's relationship more fucked up than it was in the books. However, the problem is that the writers made Drogo rape Daenerys, but then they still had Daenerys fall in love with Drogo like she does in the books. And yes, Season 2 confirms that Daenerys did indeed love Drogo by how affectionately she responds to a vision of him in the House of the Undying. Okay, making changes is not necessarily a bad thing, but you also have to realize how those changes will impact other aspects of the story, and having Daenerys fall in love with the man who raped her kind of doesn't do well to fend off the claim from people who say that Game of Thrones romanticizes rape. So how would I change this? Well, have Drogo rape Dany, but just don't have Dany fall in love with Drogo and only be faking it to manipulate him to get more power and security. This would actually do well to make her character more active and resourceful than her book counterpart. Also, it's a small thing, but I'm also kind of pissed how they cut out Daenerys' first time riding her horse in the books, which showcased her childlike wonder, or I guess just child wonder in the books. In general, I think the softness and innocence of Daenerys' character in the books doesn't shine through too often in the show, through a combination of the writing and Emilia Clarke's performance. The show also cuts out when Daenerys says in the books that she wants to kill herself, showing just how poorly she is taking to her new life among the Dothraki, which should have been kept in. Another change is that in the books, Drogo doesn't get his wound from fighting in one-on-one combat, he gets it from an arrow while he is fighting against another Dothraki tribe. I think this makes more sense than him just letting his bro cut him for some reason, and I think it would have been a pretty cool if we had actually seen a battle play out between Drogo's Khalasar and a different one. And as I said before, since magic is going to be a twist in my rewrite, the blood sacrifice to revive Khal Drogo and Dany birthing the dragons will both happen in the finale. It's also kind of weird how Daenerys still has a full head of hair after walking into the funeral pyre, when in the books all of it was being burnt off. I guess Emilia Clarke didn't want to shave, it's not that important, but it does bother me, since her losing her hair is supposed to be a physical reminder of her rebirth from the ashes. So I wish the show had a bald Daenerys in the finale. Plus, in the books, Daenerys experiences some pretty trippy dream sequences that I guess would have been really awkward to do in live action, but were really cool and were foreshadowing to stuff that will happen in the future. So it would have been really nice if, they were left in or moved to the House of the Undying, but other than that, I really wouldn't change much of anything else about Daenerys' story in Season 1. Now we get to Jon Snow's storyline. Again, not much to say here, it's almost exactly the same as it is in the books, and I liked some of the added scenes giving some side characters more depth and focus. As I said before, since the audience will be kept in the dark about the existence of the others in the show, Jon won't be fighting wights until the last episode of the series. It will take a bit of rearranging, but it actually won't be that difficult. Just have Jon imprisoned for attempting to flee the Night's Watch after Ned Stark dies, And then in the final episode, Jon discovers the Whites and saves Mormont's life, which is ultimately what redeems himself to the Watch. And also, the Night's Watch don't leave beyond the wall in the finale like they do in the original show, since at the beginning of the second book, A Clash of Kings, Jon still hasn't left the wall yet and has a pretty interesting conversation with a Night's Watchman about the War of the Five Kings, which I wish was kept. Yeah, that's pretty much it for Jon's plotline, though. Now we move on to Catelyn Tully's plotline. Again, her storyline doesn't have too many changes from the book. One interesting one is that in the book, Catelyn actually tells Ned to go to King's Landing because she is afraid of what Robert might do if Ned refuses, but in the show, Ned has already decided to go serve as Robert's hand, and Catelyn is trying to convince him not to go. I think either version works fine, as I can see legitimate reasons for why Catelyn would do either of those things, but it's just worth noting. Another change from the books is that the show actually cut out a sex scene between Cat and Ned, and I guess it isn't super important, but with the amount of added sex scenes for the show adaptation that weren't in the book, many of which don't really add anything of substance and just seem to be there to fill a nudity quota, it just bothers me that a character-building sex scene that more fully showcased Cat's genuine love for Ned was cut out. Another thing that was cut out in the show, or at least toned down, is Cat's hatred for Jon Snow. Yeah, we definitely get the sense that Cat doesn't like Jon Snow in the show, but in the books, there are several more instances where to showcase just how passionately Cat hates Jon's entire existence. I think they should have been kept in because it shows just how much discrimination Jon faced as a bastard. And although it paints Cat in a worse light, it is an important part of her character and is important for an event that will happen in Season 3 of my rewrite that was cut out of the show from the books. And also makes Catelyn's fantastic show-only conversation later on about how everything is happening as the result of her not being able to love a motherless child hit that much harder. Another thing that does bother me is that the show cut out Cat and Tyrion's journey up to the Eyrie. I get that it would have been extremely difficult to shoot that in live action, and the chapter is kind of slow in the book, but, in the book we get a sense of just how impregnable the Eyrie really is, rather than it just being told to us. The journey up to the Eyrie being cut out also means that a book character called Maya Stone is shafted as well. She's one of Robert's bastards that he fathered at the Eyrie, and she's a pretty cool character, even if she only has a supporting role. And in my rewrite, she will have some significance to the story moving forward, so yeah, I'm keeping her. But yeah, that pretty much does it for Catelyn's character. Now we move on to Tyrion's character. Again, his storyline is pretty similar to the book. One thing that was cut out is that on the journey up to the Wall, Tyrion talks to Jon Snow about how he used to dream about dragons and has read nearly everything there is to read about them, which will be important later, so it should have been kept in. Another thing I have to talk about is in Tyrion's story is something that wasn't changed from the books, and that's the Catspaw mystery. See, in the books, it's revealed that it was actually Joffrey who ordered a hit on Bran, which is for some reason never confirmed in the show, but fans of A Song of Ice and Fire criticized this as one of the only true plot holes present in the books. Basically, fans argue that the reasoning for Joffrey wanting to kill Bran, that he heard Robert talking about how it would be a mercy for Bran to die, is flimsy at best and makes no sense for why he would arm some random peasant with a Valyrian steel dagger that was owned by Littlefinger. I don't really think it's a plot hole, since it can be mostly explained by the fact that Joffrey is an impulsive idiot, but I agree that the whole scenario is a bit contrived. So in my rewrite, here's how the whole Catspaw mystery would go. We would actually get to see a scene of Robert talking with Cersei about how Bran would be better off dead than a cripple, and Cersei complaining about how their journey back to King's Landing has been held up because of Bran. This happens while Joffrey is in the same room, clearly setting up his attempt to kill Bran, wanting to please both his parents. The dagger also isn't priceless Valyrian steel, but instead dragon glass, and Littlefinger isn't lying when he tells Cat that he lost it in a bet to Tyrion Lannister. The dagger is Tyrion's, and Joffrey, rather than just picking out some random knife, was trying to frame his uncle, specifically, since it was clearly showcased before that Joffrey does not like Tyrion. I realize making Littlefinger tell the truth does detract from his character somewhat, as it means he wasn't lying to create chaos, but at the same time, he didn't have to tell the truth, and still would have been steering her towards taking drastic action. But anyway, that's how I would change the Catspaw mystery to make it less contrived. Another change is that in the books, Tyrion actually tells Bronn about his first wife Tysha while they are traveling in the Vale. In the show, however, Tyrion tells both Bronn and Shae later while they are at Tywin's camp. I guess this is a more economical use of time, and I like the drinking game that they do, but Tyrion later telling Shae about Tysha in the second book is a moment of emotional vulnerability and showcases him being fearful about his relationship with Shae ending up like his relationship with Tysha. This gets into how Shay's personality is actually very different in the show compared to the books. I understand that the writers wanted to give her more personality and make her more likable, but the changes to her character and her relationship to Tyrion ultimately culminate in one of the worst book changes in the show. I think it's fine to give Shay more depth and personality in the show, but ultimately the same major beats need to be kept. Shay doesn't love Tyrion and is just using him, and Tyrion constantly worries about whether his relationship with her will end the same way his relationship with Tysha did. Finally, we get to one of the biggest changes in the season, which is that Tyrion just straight up gets knocked out and sleeps through the entire battle with the Northern forces. This doesn't happen in the books, and we actually get to see Tyrion get his first taste of battle, which prepares him for the Battle of Blackwater later. And I know the show cut out the battle for budgetary reasons, but Tyrion just getting knocked out immediately is honestly just kind of silly. And again, in my imagination, I'm working with an unlimited budget, so the battle still does take place like it does in the books, and that's pretty much it for Tyrion. Now we get to Bran, Robb, and Theon. As I said before, Bran's three-eyed crow, or raven in the show, dreams are going to be cut out. Unfortunately, since Bran's dreams were actually way cooler in the book, to make the twist that magic is real more surprising. So it only talks about them, leading the audience to wonder what they could possibly mean. Not much else to say about Bran's character. There are smaller and more humanizing moments, like when he cries before going climbing, because even though he wants to see King's Landing, he is sad about leaving Winterfell, but nothing too major. In regards to Robb Stark, I really liked a lot of the extra scenes in the show with him that weren't in the books. For some reason in the books he doesn't get any POV chapters, so it's nice that the show gave him more focus. I also like that Theon got much more characterization and scenes than he did in the first book. One thing I have to mention is that the show introduces this character named Ross, a whore who has sex with Theon and ends up hitching a ride to King's Landing. Honestly, I would have preferred it if Ross was just cut from the show. She ends up replacing a pretty cool subplot from the books in Season 2, and her character ultimately amounts to nothing in the end since Joffrey just kills her. In the books, we learn that Theon actually knew the mother of those two boys he killed in place of Bran and Rickon, and had sex with her quite a few times, so wouldn't it have been great if Theon actually had a scene with her in Season 1, which would have made what he did in Season 2 even more fucked up? Back to Robb, though, I am a little pissed that the show cut out a scene of Robb's emotional vulnerability where he isn't sure if he can lead the Northern forces effectively, and also there's a scene in the books where Robb gets freaked out by Roose Bolton and the Flayed Men's banners, and I wish those were kept. Finally, yes, I wish we had actually seen Robb's battle in the Whispering Woods, like we see in the book through Catelyn's perspective, rather than just cutting to after Robb has already kidnapped Jaime. Plus, if we actually got to see Jaime go up against Robb's army in battle, it would give us a good sense of just how much of a monster he is in combat at full strength before he gets handicapped. And much like in the books, this would be where he kills the Karstark's sons. That's pretty much it for Bran and Robb and Theon, though. Finally, with all that out of the way, we can get to the real meat of the first season, the King's Landing plotline. Once again, it's kept almost exactly the same as it is in the books, but there are a few things I would alter. The first thing is that I think the show had way too many added scenes. One of the biggest draws in the first book is that the reader is constantly trying to figure out what is going on and doesn't know who to trust, because the story is told through a select few POV characters. I think some of the added scenes in the first season are great, like Cersei and Robert's conversation about Lyanna, and Tywin's legendary introduction with Jaime, which are both nowhere to be found in the book, but other scenes just have no point whatsoever. Like, remember the scene in the finale where Pycelle just drones on forever to Ross after sleeping with her? Yeah, sure glad that was kept in. We did not need to see all of that, and it adds nothing that we couldn't learn in a future scene in the show. However, there are other added scenes that have a different problem in that they just give away way too much. Like, in the first episode, we get a scene with Jaime and Cersei that strongly hints that there was some shady business going on with Jon Arryn's death, before the reveal that there was something shady going on with Jon Arryn's death. Varys and Littlefinger are also much less mysterious characters than they are in the book. There's this whole added scene of them having a 200 IQ spy versus spy battle of wits, and later on there is possibly the most gratuitous sex scene in the show, where Littlefinger basically directs a lesbian porno for 6 whole minutes. I really don't like this added scene because, for one thing, it's basically just an excuse for the show to have a bunch of fan service on screen while Littlefinger explains his entire backstory, which could have just been explained by Cat earlier like it is in the book. But also it kind of takes away from some of the surprise that Littlefinger ends up betraying Ned, since it's shown to us beforehand that the dude is pretty shady. There's also a scene in Season 1 where Robert is talking to Jaime, and Jaime tells him about how the Mad King was screaming, "Burn them all!" before he killed him, and It's a good scene, but why on earth would you spoil the reveal of Jaime's motivations for killing the Mad King 2 seasons early? It just ends up making the bathtub scene with Brienne later less impactful because we already semi-knew about Jaime's motivations. Overall, I just wish that the story in King's Landing in Season 1 was still presented mostly through the viewpoint of the Starks to keep the audience more in the dark. Speaking of which, we have to talk about that scene where Arya overhears Varys talking to Illyrio. It happens in the books too, but in hindsight, considering the direction the show went with Varys and cutting out young Griff, it doesn't really make any sense. I mean, in the show, Varys' motivations are to protect the realm, but setting up Viserys to come and conquer Westeros with a Dothraki army would kind of, well, be doing the exact opposite of that. So if we were going to roll with the show's version of events and cut out the Phagon storyline, and Varys' intentions really are as pure as they seem, we have to change Varys and Illyrio's conversation. In my rewrite, Varys argues with Illyrio, telling him that he has doubts Viserys would make a good king, and tells Illyrio to hold off the invasion of Westeros. But Illyrio pushes Varys, saying that things have already been set in motion, and chastises Varys for getting cold feet, and reminds him that he has debts of affection to repay. Thus, later when Varys informs Robert that Daenerys is pregnant, leading to her assassination attempt, we can interpret this as Varys trying to stop Viserys from invading Westeros. Another thing we have to talk about in the King's Landing plotline is a character who was cut from the show named Jane Poole. In the books, she's Sansa's best friend who tags along with her to King's Landing. She's not very important in the first book, but she actually ends up playing a major role in the fifth book in a plotline that was heavily altered in Season 5. I'm actually not planning to do the Jane Poole storyline in the future, though, and will instead be replacing her with Rickon Stark to bring him back into the narrative. But even if we're not going to get fake Arya in the show, I still would have liked to see Jane Poole in Season 1, since she gives Sansa a good character to work off of. Another thing that was cut from the show is that Sansa already actually tells Cersei about her father's plan to leave King's Landing. This was probably cut to make Sansa seem more likable, but I think her guilt over doing this would be a major aspect of her character later on, and so I would prefer if it was kept. Another thing that was cut from the King's Landing subplot is that in the books it is revealed that Stannis Baratheon actually investigated the legitimacy of Cersei's children with Jon Arryn, and he was the one who originally suspected that they were bastards. This showcased Stannis' perceptive nature and his concern for his brother's bloodline, and was the first of many slights to come against the one true king, and it definitely should have been left in. Finally, one other change that Season 1 made from the book version concerns the aftermath of Jaime's fight with Ned Stark. In Season 6, Bran sees a vision of his father at the Tower of Joy, but this actually happens in the book when Ned is having a dream while he is recovering from his broken leg. I think this makes a lot more sense, because that's not really how Bran's powers work. He needs a weirwood tree to see into the past, so he couldn't have been there to see what was happening in fucking Dorne. I'm just keeping it as a flashback like it is in the book, especially since it provides some pretty early foreshadowing for R plus L equals J. Like I said, in general, more flashbacks would have been nice. Anyway, that's pretty much all the specific changes I would make to the story of Season 1. Like I said, mostly minor ones. In general, I think the season could have also been a little bit more slow-paced. I know the quick pacing of Game of Thrones is what a lot of people like about it, at least until the pacing switched to ludicrous speed in the final 2 seasons, but I personally prefer stories to give a little bit more time to take things in, and Game of Thrones does tend to cut out some of the smaller, more character-building moments from the books, which I really don't appreciate. So now, with me having gone over all the plot lines individually, let's do an episode summary for my rewrite of Season 1. Episode 1 starts with a flashback of Robert killing Rhaegar on the Trident. Everything with Winterfell and Robert's arrival takes place until Bran gets pushed from the tower at the end. Episode 2 starts with a flashback of Dany at the house with the red door. Meanwhile, Ned goes off with Robert and his court, and Bran almost gets assassinated, with Catalyn theorizing he was pushed. Everything with Daenerys' plotline happens until Drogo has sex with Dany on their wedding night, and then the episode ends. Episode 3, Robert tells Ned about his spy Jorah Mormont, and Tyrion goes with Jon to the Wall and talks to him about dragons. Dany tries to get used to her new life in the Khalasar and is taught by Doreah to seduce the Khal. Everything happens with Nymeria, Lady, and the dead butcher's boy, and Bran wakes up saying he had a dream about a three-eyed crow. Episode 4, Dany stands up to her brother for the first time and humiliates him, and she gets pregnant. Catelyn arrives in King's Landing and meets Littlefinger, who tells her about the dagger. Ned arrives in King's Landing and gets a sense of the budgeting issues, and it is brought to see his wife by Littlefinger. Jon and Tyrion make it to the Wall, and Jon finds it is not what he expected. Episode 5. Tyrion is told by Mormont that the wall needs more men, and he says goodbye to Jon Snow. Ned hires Syrio Forel to train Arya and investigates Jon Arryn's death. Tyrion makes it back to Winterfell and gives Bran the saddle. Dany is brought to Vaes Dothrak and threatens to have Viserys' entrails pulled out if he ever lays a hand on her again. Episode 6. Ned continues to investigate Jon Arryn's death and meets Gendry. The King's Joust is held, and the Mountain goes crazy against Loras. Samuel Tarly shows up at the Night's Watch. Bran encounters Osha, and Catelyn arrests Tyrion. Episode 7. Tyrion is brought to the Eyrie, and Tyrion and Catelyn get attacked by mountain clansmen. Ned is told by Varys that only he can save the king, while Arya chases cats, and overhears Illyrio arguing with Varys in the catacombs. Robert orders the death of Daenerys, and Ned Stark quits being Hand in disgust. Dany eats a horse heart, and Viserys is crowned in molten gold. Episode 8, Catelyn makes her way with Tyrion up to the Eyrie. Jaime gets into a brawl with Ned in the streets, and there is a flashback to the Tower of Joy. Dany suffers an assassination attempt, and Bronn wins the trial by combat, setting Tyrion free. Episode 9, Jon sets up Tarly with Maester Aemon to protect him, and Jon is chosen as Mormont's steward. Tyrion comes across the mountain clans, and Ned condemns the mountain to death and plans to send his girls away. Jaime talks with Tywin. Drogo promises to give Dany the Iron Throne, and Ned Stark figures out that Cersei's children are bastards. Episode 10, Robert dies from his quote-unquote hunting accident after Ned accuses Cersei. Cersei has Ned's family taken into custody, and Jon hears about it at the Wall. Meanwhile, Osha tells Bran about the things she has seen beyond the Wall, and Robb tries to get used to being a Lord of Winterfell. When he hears his father was arrested, he calls his banners to go to war, as Catelyn returns to him. Episode 11, the Tullys and the Lannisters go to war, and Jaime leads the charge for his father. Robb leads his forces south, and Tyrion meets with his father. Meanwhile, Drogo attacks another Khalasar and plunders a village, and Dany realizes the price of war, and tries to save as many innocents as she can. Varys goes down to tell Ned to confess his crimes for the realm. Episode 12, Robb Stark gets the support of the Freys, Tyrion is acquainted with Shae, and Jon's conflict with the Night's Watch over his father escalates. Arya tries to survive in King's Landing on her own. Meanwhile, Dany tries to get Mirri Maz Duur to heal Khal Drogo, but he keeps getting worse, and she says that she can perform blood magic to save him. Dany worries about what will happen if Khal Drogo is dead. Episode 13, the battle between Tyrion and the North plays out, as well as Jaime versus Robb, and Bran has a dream about his father dying, and then he does die. Episode 14, Arya is taken away by the Night's Watchman and is shaved. Bran and Robb grieve for their father's death. Sansa is taken out to see her father's head on a spike. And Jon tries to desert the Night's Watch, but is brought back by his brothers and imprisoned. Tywin sends Tyrion to King's Landing, and Robb is crowned King in the North. Episode 15, the finale. Jon is attacked by corpses, and Mormont tells him he needs good men like Jon, and it doesn't matter who sits on the Iron Throne. The blood ritual is carried out with Dany, with her getting prophetic dreams about dragons, and she walks into the funeral pyre, emerging with dragons. And that's it. That was my video for how I would rewrite Season 1. Again, it's not really much of a rewrite, to be honest. I didn't really make any major changes, but I do still think it was important to lay the ground rules for how future seasons will be playing out regarding the first season. So tune in next time, because I will be talking about Season 2, which, believe you me, I will have a lot more to say about. Clash of Kings definitely has a lot of material, and Season 2 added even more to it, so there will be a lot to talk about. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed part 1 of Game of Thrones rewrite series. Be sure to like, share, comment, subscribe, and as always, remember, just because you can't feel love doesn't mean you shouldn't want other people to. Bye!